I'm going to talk about the predictive policing strategy that occurred in Chicago in 2012. It's not moving. Here we go. And I'm going to give a bit of context before getting into our evaluation, because again, this happened almost a decade ago, and this was a time in which there was a lot of movement towards sort of data-driven identification of places and people, and then intervening in those places and people. And so predictive policing, if you haven't heard about it, has places, which is really this like hotspot policing, if you've ever heard of that, with trying to forecast places that are likely to experience a crime. And in terms of people, this fit under a strategy of intelligence-led policing, if you've ever heard of that, where you're really trying to identify people who are likely to commit or be a victim of a crime and intervene. And so in the late 90s, there was this proactive policing, police departments trying, rather than patrolling an area and trying to find the right place to patrol and then respond to a call, there were these interventions. Boston ceasefire is one that comes up a lot, where they worked with individuals who were involved in gangs, and they worked with sort of social workers and courts and prosecutors, and had these interventions with people before they would commit another crime, and try to prevent gang-related violence that way. And there's also, I put up High Point model for violent repeat offenders, because High Point starts looking at all different kinds of offenses and really targeting interventions with those offenders. So you have violent repeat offenders, and then High Point's going to have another intervention that's with, for example, domestic violence and individuals who have previous domestic violence charges. And so then in the mid-2000s, when we have September 11th attacks, police are often working more at that point of like intelligence gathering and identifying individuals who are more likely to commit an offense, and really looking at the data. So big data gets a name in 2005, and you hear a lot of predictive analytics. We're going to predict places. We've got all this data. We can run all these models, and we're going to figure out crime before it happens, where it happens, who it happens to. And so then there started to be a lot of funding around, okay, let's evaluate, let's see if these predictive analytics work. And so there's a program called Predpol. There was a lot of programs. LAPD is going to use it in 2008. And then by 2012, Chicago is being named as the murder capital of the US. Not the highest crime rates as a rate, sort of per capita in the US, but as a big city, it's had the largest numbers of homicides. And so they're really actively trying to use programs, use interventions to try to reduce homicides. And at that time, it was about data and identifying people or places. And so they're going to look at this people-based predictive policing strategy to reduce homicides. So what did that look like? So the intervention was, they're going to predict people who are at higher risk of becoming a homicide victim. And the way that they're going to do this is that they have a database of people who've been arrested for a crime, of course, and they're going to see who people were arrested with, whether or not the people you've been arrested with have been a homicide victim. And they're going to see whether or not that increases the likelihood of you being a homicide victim. So we're going to call that a first degree link, where you see here subject, that's an individual who's been arrested, and their co-defendants are whether or not they've been homicide victims, and how that increases the likelihood of becoming a victim. And they're also going to include second degree links. That's if I'm arrested with somebody who was also arrested with somebody else, and did that person become a homicide victim? Okay, so they're going to see people who have been arrested with other people who have been a homicide victim, and see that it does in fact increase the likelihood of you being a homicide victim yourself. And then everybody in Chicago is, not everybody in Chicago is put on a list, but everybody is in this database. And then people who are at higher risk are put on what was called an SSL, or strategic subject list, by district. So in each district of Chicago, they're going to have a list of people who are at the highest likelihood of becoming a victim of a homicide. And what are they going to do with those people? That became also a subject of discussion. In practice, what happened was they made contact with people on the list. So how we test whether or not that worked, it's similar to what you've seen of colleagues who've previously discussed. You have in this database, you have everybody who's been arrested, and some are very low risk people in terms of the likelihood of becoming a victim, in the sense that they may not have anyone that they've been arrested with who's been a homicide victim. But then you have other people who have been arrested with somebody who's likely to become a victim, but they weren't on the list. And so what we're going to do is we're going to separate out the people who are on the list. Okay, this is the SSL group, what we would call a treatment group. They're going to receive this making more contact. And we're going to then compare them with people who are higher risk, but not on the list. So I use the word comparison group here because for some reason they weren't on the list, right? They had very similar risk, very similar criminal history. All of these things were very similar, and they weren't on the list. So we're going to do a lot of tests to make sure, there was some decision to not put them on the list. And some of these decisions, frankly, were they had to have a shorter list. So some districts had a list of 20 people. And so the 21st person just wasn't on the list because they couldn't have everyone on the list. And so here, giving you the risk scores, again, we compare those people with similar risk. Not everybody had the highest risk number. Some districts had people with lower risk. So some people will have, a risk score of 17, 24, 31, but in that district, they were higher risk. And they're compared to other people with similar risk and similar criminal histories. And so one of our main results is that we found that there was no effect on victimization for being on the SSL. The point being, you're put on a list, you're at higher risk of becoming a victim. Police were making increased contact with those people, and we have some evidence to show that that was indeed the case, that they had more contact. And here what I'm showing in that first column of that estimate is that the likelihood of somebody being a shooting victim was reduced, but not statistically significant, meaning there just is no difference of whether or not you were put on the SSL. Similarly, no difference about being a murder victim. And when we looked at any weapon outcome, maybe that's where we could have seen an effect. We still see no effect of being on that SSL. And for those who are familiar with the SSLs, we were evaluating the pilot, the very first one. And so there was discussions that the list got sort of improved and more targeted. So this is the very first list that they had, and no difference. In terms of numbers, what that looks like. So there were 405 homicides in Chicago during our evaluation period, and that was March 2013 to March 2014. And most people who were a victim of a homicide did have a criminal record, but they had none of the links. So that's the 62%. The 21% had no criminal record. So they were definitely not on the list, and they were not in our comparison group either. For those who had a criminal record and had links but were not on the list that were in our comparison group, that was 16% of the people who had homicides. And so only 1% of the people who were a victim of a homicide in Chicago that year were on the SSL list. The other main results I want to share is that the people on the list were about 3 times more likely to be arrested for a shooting. And so when you do the sort of transformation that you need to do, there's the third column there on the right. The only statistically significant finding we have is that they're more likely to be arrested for a shooting. And no change in murder arrest. And so the big question that always came up was, okay, well, you put them on a list, and then told Chicago police to go make contact with them, so they got arrested. That seems like a logical conclusion. So we went and actually tested whether that was the case, because we had their field cards. We had all the contacts that they said that they were making with people. So what we find is, as we do this mediation analysis, and we find, okay, take all the people who were on the SSL list and take those who were arrested for shootings and look at the police contacts. In fact, look at all of them, but look at police contacts. Is it the case that people who were arrested for a shooting also had more police contact? And that's not it. So we don't find a statistically significant finding there. It was not the case that they were more likely to be arrested for a shooting because they were on the list and getting more contact. Now, for this to not be true, it would take that the police kind of systematically didn't write up field contact cards for people who were on the SSL, meaning I've got all of these numbers of police contact, and the reason I'm finding that this isn't what's driving their arrest is that they weren't writing it down. But we went to all the CompStat meetings during that period. We had some great assistance from folks at the University of Chicago who were at the CompStat meetings, and we were documenting the discussion about the SSL. And at that time, it's not like now when people heard about the SSL, people were not talking about it in the same way. It was just you can go look, make contact. It was not that big of a deal. So we have reason to believe this was the relationship. So what did we learn? The policy. I have never experienced a study in which we were compared to a movie more than this one, that this was somehow Minority Report. And so I think whenever a strategy comes out, a future one following the homicides, I think we want to kind of be careful about what the strategy looks like and what people do. At that time, it became the discussion about how bias is underlying the algorithms, because the whole strategy started with if you are arrested. And so if there's bias in who gets arrested, there's ultimately bias in who we're going to predict. Second, there are some discussions about what did work, because we didn't see a whole lot in terms of homicides and victimization, and whether or not this might be a good way for identifying people for investigative purposes, and about what didn't work. Is it the case that we need better predictions and targeting the right folks? We didn't have the right information there, or those interventions. I talked about how they said they made contact with people. What was happening in Boston and High Point were actually sit downs with people and their families, and it was far more involved with other sort of institutions, social workers. And so that's a direction that people are talking more about now. Okay, and with that, I'll finish.